Pandorum is an often overlooked sci-fi horror film from 2009 that has some interesting ideas and set pieces, but like many horror films, it gets a bit lost in the third act. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the things Pandorum presents us with and trying to work out what, if anything, Pandorum is actually trying to say.
A little fucking solidarity goes a long way.
When watching a movie, I can't help myself. My brain interrogates everything, trying to work out the ideology that underpins what I'm seeing. It can be an intentional presentation of a specific point of view, such as with satirical masterpieces like Starship Troopers or Dawn of the Dead, or it can be a more subtle transmission of a creator's views that are communicated through indirect decisions. Not everything we see is explicitly ideological, and indeed, sometimes more is shared accidentally than was ever intended. After doing my AVP and Alien 3 videos, I wanted to keep going on the sci-fi horror video train, but I didn't want to tackle one of the really big movies, not yet. So I racked the brittle, cobweb chamber of my mind, and I remembered that in my DVD collection, I have some interesting little gems. Gems such as Pandorum. Now, I hadn't watched Pandorum in at least 5 years, probably closer to 10, but I did remember liking it, and so I thought, let's give it a go. It's a bit niche, it's a bit different, let's see what interesting ideological stuff we can wheedle out of it. So I watched it, and I tried to note out the interesting elements of the setting and the characters, and whilst I certainly found a few bits worth discussing, it was hard to find one vision for the movie, or one primary theme. And as it turns out, that's with good reason. Now, there will be spoilers galore from this point forward, so please, go watch the movie. If you've got Prime in the UK, it's on there already, so you can get it for what you've already paid. Do check it out. Now, according to one of the trivia snippets I found on IMDb, Pandorum is the end result of 2 merged scripts, which frankly explains a lot, and there were several references to changes made by studio request. So I sought out some interviews to verify some of this, and I found a really good one on Frankenstein's podcast, where co-writer Travis Malloy confirmed that his co-writer and director Christian Alva had a very similar script to his, and to use their own words, we melded the scripts together. Malloy's original script was a hyper-violent Robinson Crusoe in space, complete with cannibal rapists and a prison ship full of the worst criminals from Earth, whereas Alva had a vision about Earth's last hope being a colony ship heading to a new home. So they saw the blending of these two ideas as being a way to both make Malloy's script more accessible and to give Alva's a bit more edge. Malloy also mentions that they originally had a much darker ending than the one we got, where a lot of the horror remained unresolved. But despite testing really well in Europe, US test audiences hated it, and the studio pushed for a more Hollywood ending, if we can be so bold as to call it that. All of this kind of explains, I think, why I had such a hard time pinning this film down ideologically, since it is a blending of 2 very different sentiments. That being said, I'm going to examine 3 elements of Pandorum that I think say something interesting about the film's politics, and that maybe can be used to illustrate ideological arguments, regardless of the intent of the authors. Let's head into the creaking black void of the Elysium colony ship and examine the horrors hidden in its cold skeleton. The events of Pandorum all take place on the colony ship Elysium, a ship with 16,000 sleeping colonists, and a rotating crew of 3 that work for 2 years before waking the next crew and going into hypersleep themselves. But before we get into all that, I want to talk about why. Why is this colony ship travelling for 123 years across known space in the hope that their destination planet, Tarnis, is as good a potential home as probes suggest? The costs and risks involved are huge. Many lives are on the line. What possible reason could we have for such an undertaking? Well, here's the thing. The opening crawl of the movie explains that Earth's population has grown unsustainably, and that by 2153 it has reached 24 billion people, with food and water shortages a part of everyday life. According to the setting of the movie, this has necessitated the search for a new home for humanity, as the world has become essentially unlivable. This premise represents the first ideological pillar that I came across in this movie, and one that I would like to challenge, namely that of Malthusianism. Robert Malthus was an economist, born in the 18th century, who produced a book entitled An Essay on the Principle of Population, which posited that humanity has a tendency towards overpopulation. As referenced on Wikipedia, Malthus observed that an increase in a nation's food production improved the well-being of the population, but the improvement was temporary because it led to population growth. Populations had a tendency to grow until the lower class suffered hardship, want, and greater susceptibility to war, famine, and disease. A pessimistic view that is sometimes referred to as a Malthusian catastrophe. To take Malthus at face value then, human beings will always eventually overpopulate the earth if they have access to sufficient food and water. So it sort of provided an argument against helping the poor, since if you help them survive in the short term, you will be hurting everyone in the long term. Sounds a bit callous, right? That's because it is. Now, it's important to note that Malthus had a ton of biases we need to be aware of before we take their word on anything. Along with being an economist, Malthus was also an Anglican cleric and was part of a wealthy family that acted as apothecaries to the royal families of England, so it's safe to assume that their theories were coloured by these circumstances and experiences. Indeed, as referenced in Peter Bowler's 2003 book, Evolution, the History of an Idea, Malthus at least partially based this theory around his Anglican view that the constant threat of starvation was designed to teach us the virtues of hard work and moral behaviour. Interesting take, Robert. As someone from a rich family and someone that enjoyed tremendous privilege, it's not hard to see why it might suit Malthus to believe that the suffering of the poor was not as a result of the hoarding of wealth by those that won the birth lottery. No. Instead, it was only part of God's greater plan. And who can question that? But also, a moral reinforcement that those that are rich deserve to be, since clearly they're just harder working and more moral. How convenient. Indeed, Marx and Engels were big critics of Malthus, and among their many arguments against his theories, they pointed out that Malthus's theory was baggier than a 90s football kit, and it kind of ignored the fact that a better way of distributing resources might affect the end result. Marx also referred to Malthus as a baboon, so there's that too. Malthusianism remains quite popular on the political right, as it reinforces that sense that there is no point in sharing resources with the poors, since it just leads to overpopulation and a further stretching of resources, justifying both the hoarding of wealth and the lack of support provided to nullify the famines, wars and diseases that kill countless millions around the world. Who remembers Elon Musk's little flirtation with philanthropy before he went back to spunking money up the walls of Twitter HQ? As per this from Captain Amazo on Twitter. Friendly reminder that Elon Musk told the UN that if they gave him a budgeted breakdown of how $6 billion could end world hunger, he would do it. They gave him the budget and then he decided not to do it and instead decided he would buy Twitter for $45 billion. It is also important to note that there is also, of course, a strong racial undercurrent to modern Malthusianism, since population growth tends to be higher in what are somewhat haughtily referred to as developing nations, and most developing nations tend to exist in the southern hemisphere and in ex-colonial states. Western nations, having already gone through their own periods of rapid population growth, can now tut as the other nations take their turn doing the same. It was fine for us to do it because we were first, and being first is basically the same as being right. Incidentally, while searching for information for this video, Google helpfully came up with related searches over population countries, and then presented these countries. Make of that what you will. We can also see the racial element of Malthusianism reflected in the way that anti-immigration rhetoric fills so much airtime in the UK, US and EU, with the deaths of desperate asylum seekers and immigrants pitched as necessary, unless they're white of course. It is also quite telling that a Malthusian threat to Earth, as opposed to say a climate change based one, is far more convenient for capitalism, since climate change would require an examination of the way that we live and the privileges we enjoy, in a way that Malthusianism does not. If the threat to the world was Nazi-led fascism, for example, we already know that capitalism can live with that. Given what we know about the climate crisis and the tangible, provable elements already wreaking havoc in many parts of the world, I think it is fair to say there is a far bigger risk of a climate apocalypse being the driving motive by 2153, since for the Earth to reach such a population as stated in Pandorum, we would require a number of infrastructural and agricultural improvements that would in themselves mitigate many of the drivers for rapid population growth. For example, for us to feed that many people, we would need to become much more efficient with sustainable farming practices. Practices that would likely make meat eating extinct and require a much more utilitarian approach to feeding people, which would in itself likely necessitate a system for distribution that wasn't driven by free market price mechanisms. It would likely also necessitate a reduction in the rampant consumerism demanded by capitalism, as outlined by this line in a 2018 article entitled 7.5 billion and counting, How Many Humans Can the Earth Support on theconversation.com. Earth can support at most 1/5 of the present population, 1.5 billion people at an American standard of living. For a planet to produce the kind of yield we would need to feed so many, we would need to minimise the effects of climate change, which would mean actively coordinating global efforts. And that would not be possible whilst retaining capitalism as the primary economic model, as we know full well from looking at the world today, and how all parties in the UK, for example, are pushing back already weak climate change targets further and further. Capitalism and its profit motive is diametrically opposed to the kinds of action we need to mitigate climate change, consumption habits, and food production restrictions, since by its very nature, profit will always be the primary concern of any capitalist, even in the face of humanity's very destruction. And we can't even really be mad about it. It's literally how capitalism works. It has no choice but to pursue that money. Hence, it is incompatible with any non-profitable change. Finally, since we generally find that population growth decreases as a nation's economy matures and can in fact go into decline, as per this article from Euronews.com, the likelihood of the Earth's population ever reaching that level seems extremely unlikely. The UN has forecast a world population of 10.4 billion come the year 2100, based on increases largely driven by growth in the African nations, but with declining populations in Europe and the fact that fertility rates across the world have largely fallen below replacement levels of 2 children per woman. Basically, Pandorum's proposed overpopulation scenario doesn't make sense if interrogated too long, especially given that its ultimate destruction was literal in the movie, and very much physical, even speculated on as being nuclear or an asteroid by Dennis Quaid's Lieutenant Peyton.
Wiped away. We ran a full sweep off the grid and they were gone. One day there, the next, nothing.
In one day, it had to be nuclear or an asteroid.
Does it matter? My fellow crew members didn't take the news too well.
As Martin Empson and Ian Rappel put in their 2021 article, Beyond Our Numbers, a socialist argument about population and the environment, capitalist production fuels ecological destruction, because it is driven by an unrelenting quest to accumulate more wealth in the hands of capitalists. In this way, capitalism constantly creates and recreates unsustainable social relations that will need to be transformed if there is to be hope of a sustainable future. In Pandorum, we are introduced to Corporal Bauer, who finds himself in a situation familiar to many who have had a big Friday night, waking confused, with no memory and wondering where their clothes went. Bauer wakes from hypersleep to discover that the Elysium, the colony ship carrying 16,000 sleeping colonists, is malfunctioning and is overrun with flesh-eating monsters that are hunting down anybody that wakes from hypersleep. Over the course of the film, Bauer encounters an environmental scientist called Nadia, who explains that rather than the ship being invaded, these monsters actually came from within. It transpires that the sleeping colonists had been given an artificially designed enzyme in their feed tubes designed to act as a sort of evolutionary catalyst to help them adapt to the new environment on Tarnis, since no matter how similar to Earth it may be, there would likely be small differences that would need negating. However, events on the Elysium led to a rather different environment shaping their evolution.
Little Indians with the burden to bear. No more law, nothing left to care. Just three souls whose destiny had become undone because there was chop. Then there was only one. He decides to stay out and play in his room. The tenacity of games, God the devil. So that's what someone say. He grows a manhood, a self-proclaimed king, master of his own vessel, home to his own sin. He just cast out all that behaved. Just exile to the cargo home, defending us, and scavenge, feeding of their own. The king no longer wants the plague, so in return to his very slumber. And while the king slept, a whole new world evil grew as we wept.
This is where the two competing mechanics of the film begin vying for our attention. Do we care about the accidental evolution of cannibalistic tribes of future monsters, or do we care about the titular Pandorum syndrome and the effect of prolonged space travel on the human mind? Are we to focus on how the inconceivable and vast nature of the cosmos can crack open the human mind and unleash its darkest tendencies upon itself, just like Lovecraft had warned us?
2 years into their shift, one of their officers had a psychological breakdown. It drove him insane. He became convinced that the flight was cursed. He evacuated the ship. He launched them all into oblivion.
Or are we talking about how our environment can shape our character and determine our fate, especially if you factor in the unpredictable nature of smart technology? It feels like Pandorum wants us to acknowledge both the intrinsic nature of being human, with all the weaknesses inherent to the human condition, whilst also showing us how the world around us determines so much of how we behave, develop and proliferate. Whilst these two threads are not necessarily mutually exclusive, they are quite different themes, for me anyway. However, let's zoom out for a second and let's think about this in a broader sense. When Bauer first awakens, he fears the ship has been boarded by this ferocious race of flesh-eating aliens, and that they are responsible for the condition of the ship, and the dead and missing crew members. We instead learn that every single element of the disaster that befell the Elysium, much like every element that led to the destruction of Earth, came from within. It follows that we can say, thematically, that the very thing that destroyed Earth is also present on the colony ship, and will doom any future colonies, since we have not faced and learnt from it. Yes, folks. Say it with me. That's right, folks, we are talking about capitalism again. If we look back at any of the potential causes of the end of the world, even the shitty Malthusian ones, there is an element of unfinished business inherent to the creation of a new colony, since the destruction of the world is left a mystery. All of those weaknesses, corruptions, inefficiencies and contradictions will be built into the foundation of the new society. In Pandorum, this is reflected in the fragility of the human psyche, and its propensity towards great violence as a result of the Pandorum syndrome, and in the way that when we are trapped into a framework that is hostile, exploitative and inherently violent, we too will become hostile, exploitative and violent. That framework can be as literal as the cold, dark expanse of the Elysium's hold, where generation after generation of colonists were trapped for 900 years, or as philosophical as the neoliberal hellscape of the 21st century, where we watch standards of living decrease about as quickly as global temperatures increase. Now, we have discussed Pandorum's views of Earth. We have discussed Pandorum's views on humanity. Next, we shall tackle Pandorum's view on technology. Technology in sci-fi always acts as a window into the mind of its creator, as technology tends to be made as a solution to a problem. When you are a writer, you get to determine both the problems and their alleged solutions, meaning you are given us an insight into the way that your mind works. Your horrifying, twisted mind. What problem were you solving with this, Cronenberg? There are two technological elements that I wanted to call out in this section, as they are both interesting and add to the wider understanding of the movie, in my opinion at least. Firstly, the ship itself, much like in Event Horizon, is kind of treated like a character in itself, and perhaps even more interestingly, as semi-organic in some ways. It feels at times as if the misfiring and malfunctioning ship is acting as a mirror to the minds of Bauer and his commanding officer Peyton, with the power surges, sparks and collapsing walkways illustrating the damaged synapses and failing memories of the crew. On two occasions, we are shown sequences that portray an almost intestinal or womb-like quality, with Bauer and Corporal Gallo both moving through the claustrophobic conduits lined with all manner of leathery, rubbery pipes and tendrils. Gallo himself emerges naked and covered in grease and goo, huddled up in the fetal position. So I feel like the director was making quite clear there's symbology for us, and this ties quite nicely to the nature of the ship itself as a colony ship, a means for conveying life to somewhere new, acting as it does as a kind of mother. However, I think we do need to consider that we see two people birthed via the rubbery conduits in this movie, and both are ultimately found to be sick with Pandorum. This transformation is perhaps meant to signify that they have been reborn, with technology as their new mother, the environment reshaping them into the person we will watch for the rest of the movie, with both eventually succumbing to violent delusion, albeit to wildly varying degrees, which is one of the problems of Pandorum, but we can talk about that another time. This rebirth sits neatly alongside the way that we interpreted the forced evolution of the colonists into cannibalistic ferals, given the way that the framework they have been reborn into is pretty much a literal homage to the forces that destroyed Earth. Secondly, the enzyme added to the colonists' feed tubes eventually creates a race of savage cannibals, but it must be considered that it fulfilled its design brief perfectly, which was to help its carriers adapt to their environment. When you have a tool that has to work without direct human operation, it has to rely on its programming and its parameters, and can't be relied upon to anticipate things that its creators couldn't. Yes, folks, we are talking about AI. I see the evolutionary enzyme being a good example of a technology that can be created with one outcome in mind, But all it takes is an unforeseen change or a clumsy piece of coding, and it can lead to results that no one was expecting. Now obviously, when most people talk of AI, they are really talking about complex chains of algorithms, or basically strings of equations. There isn't really any thinking being done, just a series of questions being asked in order to whittle down the data to the desired answer. If the creator of the Catalyst, or any AI for that matter, is not able to conceive of a particular challenge or scenario, a creation will not be able to factor it in accurately either. It is entirely as fallible as its creator, subject as it is to all of the same failings, gaps in knowledge, prejudices, and yes, ideologies. Thus it is that we can come full circle back to Malthus and their attempt to rationalise and analyse complex social, psychological and economic systems using the lens of their own biases, experiences and ideologies. The enzyme itself can be seen simultaneously as a blameless tool fulfilling its functionality perfectly and a warning against trusting technology with too much responsibility. It can of course be argued that no creator could have foreseen every event that befell the Elysian, but the fact remains that the technology acted in an unexpected way and created a less than desirable outcome, because it was trusted with making decisions that affected human lives. In a world that is increasingly using AI as a proposed solution to humanity's problems, often by those with no understanding of its strengths, weaknesses, or even its very basic functionality, we should be careful we don't end up sleepwalking into the same situation faced by the Earth of Pandorum, with people waiting for a technological solution to an ideological problem. So let's recap on what we have discussed so far. We have talked about how the setting of Pandorum raises questions about the actual cause of Earth's destruction, simultaneously taking the Malthusian population dystopia and pairing it with information that makes that scenario virtually impossible. Capitalism drives conflict, consumption, and a lack of action in terms of mitigating climate change, which remains the largest threat to humanity at this or indeed at any time. We have talked of how the twin storylines of Pandorum, the evolution of colonists into cannibals via a catalysing enzyme, and the derailing of the mission as a result of the Pandorum psychological condition, only really work together when viewed as a wider acknowledgement that the causes of the Earth's destruction were never dealt with, and were instead brought with them onto the ship and into the New World. It would seem to me that they never transitioned away from capitalism or its inherent contradictions, and that in my reading of the movie, this became the doom of the project, whether on the journey or at its destination, since the same failings that led to the destruction of Earth are right there with them all the way. Finally, we talked about technology and how the environment and our access to technology can play a big part in shaping humanity's future, and how modern plans to entrust complex decision making to AI based on a largely flawed understanding of what that term might actually mean could lead to a nightmare scenario, less through malevolence and more through naivety. At this time, we can't build genuinely sentient machines, which means our creations are limited by our own comprehension, experiences and biases, and any deviation from the path we have prepared for has the potential for unforeseen calamity. Pandorum, as a movie, is a little messy, especially in the third act as it tries to reconcile the different threads of the two scripts, but against perhaps all of the odds, it remains a very enjoyable, atmospheric and thoughtful exploration of what humanity might do when faced with its own demise. Would humanity make the changes necessary to avoid damning itself? Or would its adherence to the way things are mean it prolongs its decline, rather than finding a way to survive that might challenge established class interests? Pandorum presents us with an Earth that refused to face its own doom, fleeing the consequences of its actions, but ultimately bringing with it the seeds of its own destruction. Let us hope our Earth can make better choices, as our future is similarly in peril, and the lack of real global change in the face of a climate crisis suggests we may be on a similar path. Thank you for watching this video. This script was a difficult one, as Pandorum is a bit of a messy film in some ways, with the focus switching between narratives and leaving me with a few questions such as, why didn't any of the other characters get Pandorum? Anyway, I'm glad I persevered. I think the bit on Malthusianism is a useful bit of background, as it is something that is going to be entering the media sphere increasingly as time goes on. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe for more of this content. And feel free to suggest films I should look at next. Please drop a comment with your suggestions below. Take care of each other, be aware, be kind, and be safe, comrades. Bye for now.